here on this side of the chapel. If someone wants to come up here, Judy, there's a lovely seat right there. Anybody else? You don't have to stand. Welcome to this panel on... there are also seats up in the choir lodge. We would like a nice place to sit with a great view of the whole event. Delighted to have you with us today, and delighted to have this distinguished panel to talk with us about what has been a cultural phenomenon in the course of the last month, and a matter of controversy for some time before that. This is the second day of a series of events on religion and the media. We had an interesting panel in here last night on religion and the print medium, and today we're looking at another medium. The proposal for this panel actually came to us from one of our alums, Eric Polikoff, who's in the back row over here. Thank you, Eric, for stimulating us to think about this. And I want to introduce to you now the members of our panel. First of all, our two distinguished guests. Father William Fulco of the Society of Jesus is a professor in the Department of Classics and Archaeology at Loyola Marymount University. He translated the Passion of Christ script from English into Aramaic and Latin, and he also served as theological advisor for the film. Amy Jill Levine is the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Professor of New Testament Studies at Vanderbilt University Divinity School and the Graduate Department of Religion, and has had an interest in this film for about a year and a half now. The members of the panel from the Yale community, in alphabetical order, are Adele Yarborough-Collins, the Buckingham Professor of New Testament Criticism and Interpretation at Yale Divinity School, Stephen Fraud, the Mark Taper Professor of the History of Judaism in the Department of Religious Studies and Chair of the Judaic Studies Program at Yale, Serene Jones, the Titus Street Professor of Theology at Yale Divinity School, and Mark Delano, Associate Chaplain at St. Thomas More Catholic Chapel and Center at Yale University. Mark has a degree in film from USC and has lectured at the Institute of Sacred Music about film and religion. So we're delighted to have this panel here with us today. The order of march will be as follows. Father Fulco will begin with a 10-minute comment, followed by A.J. Levine with another 10-minute comment, and then the rest of the panel will give their reflections on those initial comments for about 5 minutes each. At that point, we'll have some conversation among the panelists and then open it up for questions and answers from the audience. And we've asked the panel to reflect a little bit on the way in which this film has been read, how it's had an impact, how the media have picked it up and used it. I don't know if they're going to abide by those instructions, but in any case, that's what it was. I'm delighted now to turn over the program to Father Bill Fulco.
Thank you very much. One of the criticisms that was made against the very early stage of the film was there was nobody involved with the film who was competent in either the languages or biblical studies, and nobody who had a PhD. My PhD is from Yale, so I hope that counts. But it's nice to be back. I haven't been back for 30 years. So I was just on age, every bit as old as I look. Instead of having prepared things, I have just jotted notes on things, a lot of small things that have occurred to me, either in regard to the press handling of the film, or in a lot of questions that people asked. For example, Rosemary's Baby, which I'll bring up if we have a chance. That very strange scene with the satanic figure with the child. One of the things that was said very early was that Mel Gibson manipulated the press. Well, I worked very closely with this, and I'm sure there are other opinions, but his reaction was largely reaction. He knew at the very beginning, 6 months before the article appeared by Knox on the New York Times, that his old father, who was certifiably senile and says crazy things, was being interviewed and harassed to a large degree, and he said that on a Bill O'Reilly show that that there's stuff going on in the background. From then on, the press was largely we just sat back and watched it happen, and we found it very painful. Rather than, since I was personally attacked also to a large degree, as the priest who should have known better than being involved in such a thing. I tell you in all honesty that it was something that we did not manipulate, but found an extremely painful experience. For me, a lot hit during Holy Week of '02, when I personally was accused of being vicious, anti-Semitic, stupid, manipulative, and so on. It was beyond me to some degree. It was the press. The press does that, to some degree. And but it is my perception, and one we've talked about a lot on the crew, is that we really didn't. We just wanted a little bit of peace to get this movie done at the beginning. Later on, there was obviously a very strong reaction from the Icon Productions. But for the first year, it was pretty much watching things happen. As somebody commented, it was $30 million worth of free publicity is the way it ended up being. But it wasn't stimulating. But I'd like to talk about something how Mel Gibson saw the film in the first place, what his spirituality was. And it's what drove all of us. We became a very tight crew in working on the film because we began to share his vision. And Mel, by his own admission, in the late 80s and the early 90s, was a drunk, a drug addict. I might say that I'm very open about it. I'm an alcoholic myself, recovering about 20 years. So Mel and I speak the same language in that regard. We know where each other's coming from. And I've had my past too, so we gelled. The expression he used to me once is not that he found Christ, he felt that Christ found him, that the passion reached down to him, that his own sufferings began to make sense in the light of Christ's sufferings. It's something he found hard to articulate, and what it meant to him was that somehow suffering can have a redemptive value. And some have commented, especially in the press, that isn't this just Braveheart revisited? Well, there's something to that, but it's not quite. Is that for 10 years he struggled with how is he going to express his own deep personal experience that suffering can have a redemptive value to it. And when it came to Braveheart, obviously one of the themes of Braveheart is that suffering has redemptive possibilities. Also, you see his Mel's streak for brutality, which he doesn't deny. He finally felt, about 3 years ago, that he had to be on how he felt saved, how he felt that Christ reached into his life and saved him. And what drove him in this film was to pose to the viewer the same things that were posed to him, is the question, who do you say that I am? That's the big one. And I've been quite struck by how people who are adverse to the film, or people who like the film, people who are indifferent to it, it's hard to be totally indifferent. Is that somehow you're forced to a crisis. It strikes me very much as in John's Gospel, that everybody that Jesus meets, or is proclaimed in John's Gospel, faces a crisis of decision. And that was intentional on Mel's part, especially at the pietà at the end, when Mary simply looks out at the audience and says, did you have any part in this? What do you think is happening? What do you think is going on? He's not trying to tell you, he's asking the question, what do you think is going on? The line that has received a lot of attention when Jesus turns and says to Pilate, the one who has done this, is more guilty than you. Mel, in his own mind, is not referring to Judas or to Jews or to Caiaphas or anybody else. Again, he's challenging he means to provoke the viewer. Are you the one who has done this? Would you have known better? It's the constant question he's asking because Mel felt in his own experience that was the question that was being asked of him. I'd be glad to pursue that if anybody would like to. A question has come about authenticity vis-a-vis the New Testament. It's been very strange to the press. There's that bizarre article in Newsweek a few weeks back it was bizarre. It addressed that issue, but it was a lot of ignorance. But some of them have been very learned articles, and some have said, the problem is he's strayed too far from the New Testament. Some have said, no, the problem is he stayed too close to the New Testament. The New Testament, modern biblical scholarship, So it's one way or the other. In fact, Meach's article had both ways. First, it was too close to the New Testament, that was not close enough to the New Testament. What has to be emphasized, and I think this is consistently missed in the press, is that this film is not a documentary. It's a work of art. And what a work of art does is try to take some core historical incident, or set of incidents, and to combine it with its meaning, and the meaning is up to the artist, and to present it that way. If you were to, for example, to cross your best friend in the street, and your best friend looks at you and then goes over to the other side of the street and ignores you completely. How would you describe that? You could say, I met my best friend in the street and nothing happened, which is accurate, historically accurate. Or you could say, I met my best friend in the street and he slapped me in the face. That's actually, in a sense, more accurate. Because it's taking the event, the core event, and combining it with meaning in such a way that you're presented with a package that you can't quite pull apart. And that's what art does. If you look at Michelangelo of gods touching index fingers with Adam, do you think that happened? But I think it's a very profound theological statement of God's creation and God's relationship to creation into humanity. That's what art does. And so I have to emphasize that when people question the interpretation of the New Testament, was it historical? I think that to the Jesus seminar. God save us. But I think that one has to understand Mel's viewpoint. This is the meaning he perceives of the Passion event as he experienced it in his own life. And he asks the question, is this your experience? He wants to challenge you with his experience of this. Something that's occurred to me in the great question, is the film anti-Semitic, which has been something I've come to realize very deeply. I was just telling AJ that at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, we've been very much in dialogue with the University of Judaism, which is up the hill from us, and where I taught myself for 10 years. We're discovering the different pairs of glasses. We see things from different viewpoints. And even in vocabulary, sometimes we're going like this without realizing it. And parenthetically, I might mention this. After the Vatican Council, I think to some degree, Christians with Christians in our various denominations, and Christians with Jews, and Christians and Jews and everybody else, made a decision to make nice. And I think a lot of issues and perceptions, differences in perceptions, we chose not to look at because they make us uncomfortable. Let's make it nice and see where we can go from there. And I think one thing this film has done is bring some of those things to the surface. That we've been there all the time. Is that sometimes we're seeing things differently, and we have to deal with that, and we have to face it. We've made nice now for 30 or 40 years, and now some things have emerged that we simply have to deal with on a more honest. I'm hoping that one of the results of this film can be that we'll have a more profound and honest dialogue, not only about the things that unite us, about things we can make nice, but about even the things that separate us and where we've consistently been misunderstanding over the centuries. Yes, I think that one thing that Mel was very sensitive at the beginning, and we all were. I didn't win all my battles with this. There's something about film I don't like too. I didn't produce and direct the film. I'm very proud of it. I'm very proud of my role in it. For example, I think that I would not have had the flagellation scene go on so long. I would have made the resurrection scene far more prominent. I would have had one of the Marys at least involved in it. If we are supposed to be identified with Jesus in the Passion, we should be also identified with him in the resurrection. It's our victory, not just his. I lost that battle. I remember telling Mel, what are we going to do about the problem with the resurrection? He said, what problem? That ended that discussion. I lost my train of thought. This is not unusual. I think Mel from the very beginning was trying to do a balancing act. He perceived, as all of us perceive, that Christians and Jews will perceive this film somewhat differently. One minute. I'll talk about Rosemary's Baby. It comes up in a question. And there's a tentative and so on. Is to balance Jewish sensitivities. We've become a lot more sensitive since the film, realizing there are issues, things we didn't see and perhaps should have seen. With Christian authenticity. The answer to one person's sensitivity is not to deny your own tradition. And Mel wanted very much to say, I'm a Christian, the Passion has changed my life, I'm sorry, I'm going to proclaim that. And how to balance those two was a question from the very beginning. So I shall actually do as told. I shall pass on. My 1 minute is over.
Good afternoon. The reason I'm here is because Harry and Margot think I'm occasionally amusing, so thank you for inviting me. But also because I was one of the scholars who served on the committee that looked at the script, so I've been dealing with this since pretty steadily since about last Easter, which is when we got the script. It made a hell of a Holy Week. In terms of media coverage, I've already written on this. I did a report for Mark Silk, who runs the Center for Religion and Media at Trinity College, Hartford. And you can find that report online. So what I'd like to do is simply talk about the 13 major foci in the media and why this has become such a big media event, and then shift and talk about why American public and now the international public are seeing quite such different movies. In terms of how the thing in the media works, as far as I can tell, scandal sells. So here are the scandalous elements that have kept the movie in the news. 1, conspiracy theories. In January of 2003, which is as early as I was able to track it, Mr. Gibson started to report that forces were seeking to stop his making the movie. I couldn't locate what those were, at least in terms of media archives, but at least there was some sense of conspiracy out there. The idea of a conspiracy theory is still out there. Most recently, Pat Buchanan, that great model of impartiality for whom I think my in-laws voted, stated, Mel Gibson invests $25 million of his own money. This is 3 weeks ago, this is recent. Mel Gibson invests $25 million of his own money to do a film on the Passion of Christ and is scourged near to death as an anti-Semite before anyone has seen the film. Power brokers in Hollywood tell the New York Times they will destroy him. So I looked for the Times article where the power brokers were cited, but I couldn't find any. So conspiracy theories. 2, bigots and Holocaust deniers are always good news, and Mr. Gibson's father has added to that, and I don't think that needs to be discussed. I will say, however, that people on the Scholars Committee did not believe that Mel Gibson should be charged with his father's moving ideas. We never thought that. But the fact is those ideas are known in general public, and unfair though it is, people do wonder about Mel Gibson's own sense regarding the Holocaust. 3, it's always good for press coverage to talk about dishonest scholars and stolen scripts. So we were charged with stealing the script. I have no idea, actually, how we got the script. I certainly didn't think we stole it. At the same time, early on in May, we were accused of being indecent. And comments about the Scholars Committee got worse than that. Bill mentioned the hate letters that he's gotten. I hate to tell you how many I've gotten. I will also say that the close to 400 letters that I've gotten that have been negative, I have responded to every single one. It got easy after the first month because I had a template. I mean, you knew what they were going to say, and I could just cut and paste. About 90% wrote back and apologized. And this is a sense where people just aren't listening. They're presupposing and they're making judgments based on no evidence whatsoever. From dishonest scholars and stolen scripts, we move to anti-intellectualism and anti-elitism, because anybody who's in the academy, if you can get knocked, that's good for the press. This is Mel Gibson himself talking about the Scholars Committee. The Scholars Committee was sent in a confidential report. They were more or less saying that I have no right to interpret the Gospels myself because I don't have a bunch of letters after my name. Just get an academic on board if you want to pervert something. You should all here take that personally. We were subsequently classified along with the anti-Christian entertainment elite, that's Laura Ingram, and elite media. Elite's big news here. If you're elite, you're bad. And elite media seeking to destroy Mr. Gibson. That's Bill O'Reilly, who's good for numerous quotes. The forces of censorship comparable to those of the Inquisition and Soviet Russia. That's David Horowitz. And modern secular Judaism that wants to blame the Holocaust on the Catholic Church. That's Mr. Gibson himself. When my colleague Paula Fredrickson, who has been quite blunt about what she thinks, wrote an essay on this whole affair over the summer for the New Republic, David Horowitz labeled her a demagogue and ignorant bigot and labeled the report just another Station of the Cross. And we actually, when we sent in the report, did it with complete benevolence and hope that we would have some sort of conversation with Mr. Gibson. Point 5 for the media, bait the Jews. Now, whether this was intended or not, this is how it played. Showing the movie to select audience and not letting in Jews made Jews nervous. It also made a good number of liberal Christians nervous. There was also the controversy over Matthew 27:25, his blood be on our heads and on our children. As I recall, and you may know this, the line was not in the script that I saw. Over the summer, Mr. Gibson, it got in, and then Mr. Gibson said he was going to take it out. And then somehow in January it got back in again, and then Mr. Gibson said he was going to take it out for dramatic reasons. But it's actually still in the movie. You can hear the Aramaic. Yeah, you can. You can hear dam and banim or something like that. So it's in the film, it's just not subtitled. I don't know whether it's going to show up in the director's cut. Death threats are always good. interview, Mr. Gibson stated that he was forced to remove certain elements for the script, or they, it wasn't clear who the they was, but the antecedent seemed to have been the Anti-Defamation League, would come to his house and kill him. So this is setting up Mr. Gibson, whether he intended this or not. I'm simply reporting what the media has covered. He was set up as a new Jesus and being persecuted by Jews. Seventh point that sells, bad boy rhetoric. Responding to a critical article by New York Times columnist Frank Rich, who has, I think, gone after Mr. Gibson in a somewhat nasty way. Mr. Gibson did state, I want to kill him, I want his intestines on a stick, I want to kill his dog. Mr. Rich then immediately assured his readers he didn't own a dog. But bad boy rhetoric plays. 8, Jews control the world, or at least Hollywood. Whenever the Anti-Defamation League issues a statement, or as far as I can tell, burps, we hear about it. We rarely hear liberal Catholic or Protestant clergy cited. We never hear anything cited from Eastern Orthodoxy, although a good many Eastern Orthodox clergy have made comments about it, because Eastern Orthodoxy is off the American radar. What's particularly striking to me about the media coverage is when the Anti-Defamation League first made a public statement, which was June 24th, that's relatively late in the game. Since then, the media has spun it basically the Jews versus Mr. Gibson. So related to that point 9, the Jews don't want you to know the truth. And things like Jews are trying to keep Mr. Gibson from making the movie, and he's the only one who's got the guts enough to defeat the Hollywood Jewish elite and make the movie. Anything to do with the Vatican sells, and you probably know about all of that. The personal life of stars sells, and Mr. Gibson's own personal piety has been much to the fore. And you've heard this from Bill, and I have no reason to doubt it. Lots of fundamentalist Christians gathered together anywhere sells. So the New York-based Catholic League that bought 1,200 tickets for the Orange County Saddleback Church, which is this huge evangelical church, purchased 18,000 tickets. That's gonna sell. News reports leading up to the release date showed interviews with people who had seen the movie in almost like the week before, and much of this were there were showings that were bought out by churches, and people were weeping and crying, and there were altar calls. That was big news. I live in Tennessee. That was the lead news item the day that the film opened. I mean, other things happened in the world, but not that you could tell from the Tennessee media. And third point, religion and violence sells, and the violence of the movie, and it's certainly violent, has been part of the deal. What to make of the film then? People will see with different eyes and come away with different reactions, and some of those reactions will be based on what sort of media people read. If you read the New York Times or Newsweek, you'll come away with one view. If you follow reports from Zenit magazine or Newsmax, from the first very Catholic and conservative, the second Protestant conservative, you'll come away with other views. So quickly, here's why you will. If you begin with basic Christian theology that Jesus died to atone for humanity's sins, and it's sin, not the Jews who killed him, you will not see, for the most part, an anti-Jewish movie. Moreover, there are a few scenes that make it clear that Romans are oppressing Jews. Simon of Cyrene gets called "you Jew," and it's clear that he's being oppressed. Some Jews do protest the Sanhedrin trial. The film's Virgin Mary is a woman whose grandfather died in Auschwitz, and she didn't think it was anti-Semitic. And if anything, it's the Romans who are brutes. So Christian theology and select scenes prove it's not anti-Jewish. To others, the movie simply confirms an already set notion that Jews bear special guilt, but I don't think it inculcates anti-Semitism. If you begin as a bigot, you'll read the movie as one, and clearly that has been done. One major research group looking at internet sources basically said there were 4 dominant themes on the internet regarding the movie. These are: Jews squelch public expression, the Jews are attacking our God, I'm tired of the Jews complaining, and this is one that I got a lot in email too. Just as Jews today are seeking to destroy Palestinians, so they tried to destroy our Lord. When in doubt, throw in the Middle East. Others have seen the film as profoundly anti-Jewish. For some, all of the Jewish characters who are not proto-Christian or physically ugly have bad teeth, wear garments that look like prayer shawls, are associated with coins, and are marked by mob violence. Judas is tormented by demon children who wear kippos, yarmulkes. The proto-Christians, this I learned from Michael Morrison, who's a musicologist at Swarthmore College. The proto-Christians are accompanied by major fifth chords with full orchestration. Sounds kind of, Europe-y. And the Jews are accompanied by augmented seconds, which is klezmer music or fiddler on the roof. I don't know if that's true, but I found that fascinating. Gibson signals the temple's destruction, and so for some promotes supersessionism and triumphalism. The movie is replete with non-biblical scenes that somehow seem to exacerbate Jewish evil, like Jews throwing Jesus off a bridge. The movie makes Pilate almost a saint and Mrs. Pilate surely one. Pilate executes Jesus in the movie because, as he states, if he doesn't, Caiaphas will start a riot. In John 11, Caiaphas says, if we let Jesus go on like this, the Romans will come and destroy our holy place in our nation. That is, Caiaphas is doing what he can to stop a riot, not start one. Some have noted that the movie draws on the Gospels' most potentially anti-Jewish scenes. Only in Matthew does Pilate wash his hands. Only Matthew has the blood cry. John doesn't have the Sanhedrin hearing. Luke doesn't even name Caiaphas. For some, Jesus is stripped of his Jewish identity. He wears neither head covering nor tzitzit fringes, and the tzitzit are mentioned in the Gospels. In fact, the kippah-wearing Simon of Cyrene loses his kippah after he helps Jesus. And still others have found the movie incomprehensible, boring, pornographic, sadistic, homophobic, sexist, and feminist. We all come away with different presuppositions, emphasize different scenes, and take away different messages. I suspect that a good 3/4 of you now think that I've condemned the film. I have not. I have not given my opinion of the film. I've simply listed. Who knows? Perhaps Mr. Gibson, in his effort to show how Jesus has suffered, will develop the sensitivity to look through other people's eyes and see how other people have suffered as well. I think he does care about that. And I would hope that he would be able, without compromising his own strong faith, because I agree with Bill here, we've simply been too nice in interfaith dialogue. And I think we've simply given up too much. I think particularly Christians have given up too much on the altar of interfaith sensitivity. That perhaps Mr. Gibson will figure out some way of expressing his own incredibly strong faith, but do so in dialogue with Jews to make sure that a pro-Christian view does not read, at least to some, like an anti-Jewish one. It's too late to do anything with the movie now, but it's not too late to stop the media from continuing to divide Jew from Christian and Christian from Christian. Thank you.
All right, I'd like to just make a couple of remarks about crucifixion and antiquity, and then focus on what seems to me to be a key theological theme in the film, and ask how does that square with the New Testament. First of all, men were usually crucified in antiquity nude. Now, it may be that that was not done in Israel, the land of Israel, because of Jewish sensitivities about nudity, which we're very strongly against. But that's an important thing to keep in mind. And that's an indication that the major intentions in the act of crucifixion are to shame the person, to degrade the person, and humiliate him, as well as put him to death. Now, the question of torture, the main intended torture in crucifixion is the length of time the person had to hang on the cross before he would die. Scourging was a regular preliminary, but it was most certainly not as lengthy and as brutal as it is portrayed in the film. So, Gibson's theological interpretation of the death of Jesus, it seemed to me that one important theme was that Jesus' suffering had to be great and extreme and intense enough to be able to compensate for all the sins of all humanity. How does this square with the New Testament? Now, this issue is contested, but I'm convinced that the New Testament does speak about Jesus' death as atoning for sins. Some pretty clear examples are Romans 3:21-26, where Jesus' death is spoken about as a sacrifice of atonement or expiation for sins. John 1:29, here is the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. And Hebrews 9:10, he removed sin by the sacrifice of himself, and their blood is spoken about a great deal as a means of atonement. Having said that, though, I think it's very important to keep 2 points in mind. One is this language about the death of Jesus atoning for sin is a metaphor. It's, if you like, poetic. It's not a statement, a simple statement of fact. And secondly, it's only one metaphor among many. So these two dimensions of the use of that language indicate that it should not be taken literally. And I think it's wrong of the film to imply that the quantity and the degree of the suffering of Jesus is crucial. Now, that doesn't mean, I think, that it was just the fact that Jesus died that is significant for the New Testament. It would be a very different state of affairs if Jesus had died of natural causes, or if he'd been executed in a quick, painless way. In the New Testament, the suffering of Jesus does become a model for others. It becomes a model for Paul, and his suffering is depicted as like that of Christ, and it becomes a model for all of Jesus' followers. But again, I think it's very important to emphasize that this suffering is not presented as an end in itself or as a good thing or anything to be sought or to be allowed to continue. The point, it seems to me, is the maintaining of the empowerment of people to be able to maintain their trust and their personal integrity in a situation of unavoidable suffering.
I had not received marching instructions to focus on the media, so my notes are somewhat different from that. And I'm, on the one hand, speaking as a historian of ancient Judaism, but on the other hand, I can't avoid also speaking as a Jew. Before, I did want to make two comments on things that were said, first by Bill Fulco, that Gibson did not intend this as a documentary, but a work of art. Yet, already prior to the film's release, at least one interview that I saw him give it with Diane Sawyer, he seemed quite unambiguous, to me at least, that he was saying that if you don't like the movie, blame the Gospels. In other words, that the movie was simply an accurate representation, to the extent possible, of course, in film medium, of the Gospels, and also that this was history, that this was an act, that is, that the film and the Gospels did represent what took place. Which does then raise the interesting question of, can you separate a piece of art from the artist? Because having heard these interviews, having been exposed to a bunch of the media hype in advance of the film's release, is it possible to view the film as a work of art in its own right, sort of complete unto itself, without considering the context of the filmmaker, the history? Having already read Paula Fredrickson's report on the attempt by scholars to bring to the attention of Mr. Gibson, the filmmakers, the historical inaccuracies and these potential insensitivities, is it possible to sort of bracket all of that and just look at any work of art as a work of art independent from its context? And as a historian, of course, part of what I'm always stressing to students is that any text, and using the word text broadly, needs to be read in context. Of course, without reducing the text to the context in any simply reflexive sort of way. And therefore, the life and death of Jesus has to be understood in the context of first century Galilee and Judea, whose contours we are increasingly able to sketch, albeit still without a whole lot of certainty, but we're sort of seeing more and more of the picture. And of course, the Gospels have their contexts, which are very different from those of Jesus' life and death, and of course, which inform their accounts. And we have to stress very varied accounts, and there is some sense that the Gospels become increasingly anti-Jewish in their representation, particularly of the Passion scene as you progress through time. And Gibson, of course, and his movie have their contexts, and can we read the movie or see the movie in any sense independent of Gibson's history as an actor and from the possible influence of his father, as much as that might seem unfair, and all of the media hype that preceded the actual release of the movie. I think it's virtually impossible at this point to go and see the movie without coming to it with a whole set of expectations, fears, assumptions, if only from the last year or so of what's been going on in the media. And of course, each viewer, as H.A. has said, brings his or her own variety of contexts to the viewing of the movie, not the least of which is the sorry history of Jewish-Christian relations, certainly in the last 50 years, but of course over the much longer course of 2,000 years. Part of what struck me in coming out of the movie and talking to people and reading a variety of different reports and evaluations in the press and internet and so forth is how is it that different viewers, and I don't mean just Jewish as one group and Christians as another group, but even subgroups within Jewish and Christian and whatever other categories you want to think of, how is it that viewers can view the same movie and come away so differently moved by it? I intend that as a pun, but it seems that one has to think of it in emotional terms, in virtually opposite directions. How is it that we can view the same images and hear the same dialogues in such very different ways, bringing such very different contexts of our own lives and experiences to it? However much I might wish that the movie had not been made, or perhaps had been made differently, it is now a fait accompli, and I think as educators, and we're all educators in one sense or another, we have to think about how to use the movie as educators say a teachable moment. That is, what would we wish to teach by this movie? I think that that's really how we need to go forward, both individually and collectively as educational institutions. And it seems to me the question of whether Gibson or his movie is anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish, either in its intent or effect, is by now an arid and fruitless question. I'm not sure it was ever a fruitful question. And even if we were to label it with such pejoratives, where does that leave the believing Christian who is moved by the movie to tears, or the traumatized Jew who leaves the theater with a feeling of fear or being threatened? The teachable moment for me, it seems, is to try to understand, for me as a Jew now, how such a horror film could be so deeply moving and spiritually uplifting to believing Christians of goodwill, and to hope that such Christians will seek to understand how this film could be so depressing and distressing to Jews of goodwill. If Jews and Christians can react so oppositely to the same film, does this not belie, and here I'm repeating the panelists here, does this not belie the rhetoric of a uniform Judeo-Christian tradition, and rather enable us to understand how very different our respective media of redemption are from each other, and yet how deeply embedded violence and suffering are to both? Thank you.
I too didn't know that I was supposed to respond to specifically media responses to it, but unfortunately my first comment does have to do with this. I think it's very interesting, just as an observation, that in North America today, the public square of our imaginations is a movie. It's very different from the local meeting house in downtown New Haven that had pews and a pulpit in it where people would gather to debate topics of the day. Rather, where we meet to debate topics of the day is an imagined space, and it's the space of a big screen production. I saw the movie last night. about midnight. The movie ended at 5 till 12. Got in the car to drive home, went past blinking signs that were telling us not to drive on 95 South. Later to find out a tractor trailer had blown up the fuel tank and melted a bridge out. I walked into my front door to find my babysitter who had waited up for me, coming forward to greet me with the question, "So what did you think?" And excuse me, but I just blurted out my reaction to it, and I said, "You know, Maria, that's the stupidest, grossest movie I've ever seen." It just came out of me. And I looked at Maria, and her face fell. And it was immediately apparent to me that she felt profoundly differently about the film. She's from Latin America, and she is in New Haven, active in a conservative evangelical church. And when I asked her what she meant by this, initially all she could say was that it mattered to her that Jesus suffered. Clearly for her, Jesus was not a sanguine character. But I found myself wondering, as I went to bed last night, what was it that Maria saw in this film that I didn't see? I wasn't so concerned about what Mel Gibson saw. I was fascinated by the question, what did she see? What I want to do here very quickly is give you my response to that question. And I want to do by first describing to you what I see when I view the cross, not through the lens of Mel Gibson's production, but through the space of my own piety. Growing up in a very Christocentric denomination in which the cross was central to my piety, and in which the suffering of Christ has always been central to my understanding of who he is as the Son of God. When I see the cross, I see something layered and complex. The first thing I see when I look at the cross and Christ hanging on it is the horror of a world that kills him. I look at the cross and see myself as a sinner. Secondly, I look at the cross, and imposed upon this, I see a God who knows the depth of human suffering. I see a God who is human, and who in that humanness and suffering stands in solidarity with us. And thirdly, I look at that cross, and I see a God who in the face of evil would not turn away. I see grace. So what I see when I look at the cross is a kind of harsh, cruel realism about the brokenness of the world, and yet a persistent hope, an alternate way of being in its midst. It's a complex layering, a paradox worthy, I think, of our complex lives. Now, what did Maria see? I don't know, but the minute she began speaking, I reflexively imposed upon her what I know of the conservative religious right. And it's not necessarily an imagination that I think is descriptive of how people actually carry on the messiness of their daily lives, but it is a theology that is preached, and it is a theology that lives in many religious imaginations. And in this theology, the world looks something like this. We are caught in the midst of a cosmic battle between good and evil. Stark lines are drawn. There are good people, there are bad people. And the good are innocent. They are morally innocent, without culpability. And evil is assaulting good, and the good are victims. And the victims can bear the pain of the assault. And in bearing the pain of assault, victory comes in the form of an earthquake, a denouncement, a resurrection. In the film, we, the innocent, as Maria saw it, are Jesus and his followers. And in the film, they, the evil ones, are the Jews and certain Romans. In the film, I saw no complexity with respect to these points, particularly with respect to the evil ones in this stark world. The Jews represent the other, as does the snake, who, interestingly enough, initially in the film is a very transgendered character. You're not clear at the beginning whether the snake is male or female. clearly depicted in a sexually ambiguous way. Is Herod in the film, are we to believe, gay? What is being depicted here? A world in which we can see the others as Arab-looking terrorists, as mobs, as children who chase Judas. Franz Fanon tells us that psychic life is a political formation. I also read this film in light of that imaginary as the story now that some would like to tell about our nation, and particularly the Bush administration's view of it. In this film, transposed as a political story, we occupy the space of innocent victims. We need a victim story as a nation right now. Particularly because this film hides the culpability of empire, it functions that way. At the end of the film, right before the resurrection, we come to ground zero. We are on the day of 9/11. The earth shakes, the earth everything shatters. But what the film doesn't do is also bring us to the ground zero, that is Baghdad. The ground zero that is in Afghanistan. The ground zero that is Matthew Shepard's body. But I want to end by coming back to Maria. When I heard her and saw her face betray her feeling about the movie, I have to admit that I invoked a psychic space that scares me. Because I have my own relationship to that kind of narrative about the world. Particularly growing up as a woman, growing up as a Native American in Oklahoma. We all have our stories that can be read into that context and the fear that it invokes. Going back to the story, the minute I got scared, my mind believed that that was the psychic space in which she was living in as she saw the movie, as she reflected on the movie. I became defensive and fearful and imposed upon her a similar worldview. It became a way of reading the world in which she and all that she represents becomes the other. And it's striking to me that in many ways, the secular left in this country has had a reaction to the film that in some ways mirrors this dynamic. That the film itself becomes symptomatic of an other that needs to be resisted at all costs. And the problem with that is it gives us a very unnuanced way of reading the phenomena of religious fundamentalism in the world right now. When I asked Maria this morning if she wanted to talk about it a little bit more, she said yes. I asked her why the suffering, what it meant to her. I didn't say why it was so clean, what it meant to her. And she began, and you've never told me this before, to describe when she was in high school, her brother being kidnapped by the Ecuadorian military and tortured. And she ended the conversation by saying, in North America, you just don't understand. And I was left thinking about this movie and the fact that when it comes to the cross, yes, particularly with respect to the complexities of our imaginations, there's so much that we don't understand.
When I asked Dean Attridge why I was being invited among the scholarly company here, he mentioned, well, we're interested in your film background and what that might bring to the discussion. So that's what I'm going to share with you. Before I saw the film, I was a little apprehensive, not because of the controversies or because of what I had heard about the level of violence, but because of knowing Mel Gibson from his other films and his status as an action movie star. And I wondered how that might affect his treatment of the story and whether he might lack some of the subtlety necessary for treating this kind of story. I had also heard interviews where he kind of disparaged past treatments, film treatments of the Jesus story, including Zeffirelli's Jesus of Nazareth, which I think is a great movie. And so when I heard that, I was thinking, well, here's a movie, Zeffirelli's, that is attempting to be just as scripturally literal and is just as much of a statement of personal devotion and tries to include dramatic license in in just as significant a way, and yet was hailed by Jewish leaders when it came out as being very sensitive to the depiction of Jewish culture at the time. So, with that background going into it, I thought, is he up to this task? I had a mixed reaction, and I would say it's not so easy to come down one way or the other. I think I experienced very subtle and visually appealing moments that show emotional connection, provide this incredible emotional backbone to the film, which I think is a connection between mother and son, which I think is beautiful. Does it succeed? Does it fail? Again, how do you measure that? To me, it's not an either or. To me, ultimately, I would say it succeeds in what he wanted to do. He made the movie that he wanted. It's connecting with audiences. He's handling the medium very well. It's successful. On the other hand, I could say it's flawed. It's flawed in other ways, maybe deeper ways, narratively, dramatically. There's a problem of context here. Well, that would be the first thing I would mention, the idea of context. What kind of context is offered for understanding these events, caring about these characters? I mean, for those of us who are Christian, we can enter this story at any point. We're used to entering it. If you go to church on Sunday, you can enter this story at any point. We know enough about the characters, we know enough about the person, we know Jesus, we can enter into this story at the Passion, and it will be incredibly meaningful. We have the resources to do that. I think of others, though, people who don't know the whole story. Would they be able to appreciate what's going on? Would they be able to appreciate why this is important? Maybe they won't feel as much because they haven't gotten to know who he is. I've been reading the student reviews in the student papers here on campus. There was one review that was very, very good. A student named Alexander Nemsner. He made the point to a viewer who has no familiarity with the story, this film seems incoherent. Who is this man? Why do these words evoke this kind of reaction? So less context has that possibility of less understanding. So the question, why make a Passion movie at all if that's the case? Well, I think some people have raised that as a question. For me, that's not a question, unless you want to say that Bach and any of the other artists who have tried to treat the Passion are somehow wrong. I think there is a way to do it. But I think coming from a Christian perspective, I think a Christian will want any work of art about Jesus to communicate Christ, to help people get to know Christ better. And I think I would look at that as in terms of two polarities. On the one hand, on one side, of one polarity, you could say a Christian work of art can be just a personal devotional piece of art. And I think that's valid. It could be just for people who know the story in a way to deepen their appreciation. On the other hand, on the other polarity, I think the Christian would also be very concerned about it being accessible, about it being able to reach out to believer and unbeliever, to be evangelical, however you want to put that. Now, there's always going to be overlap. They're always going to be together in the piece. And like I said, I think this movie is valid as devotional art. I think it might be flawed, and it might stumble when it comes to that idea of accessibility, which means an important opportunity is missed, and misunderstanding is possible. And that's what I think we've seen. Secondly, I think much of what he's been criticized for, from my perspective, can be understood in terms of dramatic choices, can be understood in terms of the limitations of this form, and as well as some insensitivity to some extremely important issues, which was very unfortunate. But I think when Mel Gibson was approaching this project, and it's a working project over months and years, I think given the limitations of his form, the question that he's probably asking is, what is going to make this more dramatic? I mean, that's the Hollywood question, and he's approaching it as a Hollywood producer, director, filmmaker. So I think that's why you see some horror genre conventions thrown in here. He's bringing back sensibilities. You know, Judas, let's have him see a demon here, or let's have this decaying animal be the visual analog to express what's going on. That's the genre he works in, and his film company, Icon, often works in that genre. Or when he approaches an emotional moment and he tries to make it as wrenching as possible. Bring out all the emotional content of it. Mary mopping up the blood of Jesus at the pillar. That kind of thing. These moments work dramatically, and they're very effective. When I've had occasion to talk to screenwriting students, and I talk to them about the Hollywood conventions as they relate to narrative structure, what does a Hollywood producer say? Heighten the stakes. You have to create increasingly difficult obstacles for the hero to surmount. You have to have augmented opposing forces. You have to strengthen your villains. I mean, there's never been a British officer in The Patriot. I don't know how representative that particular officer was. I heard he was modeled on a historical figure, and yet I'm sure it wasn't representative of all British officers. But I think you have that same dynamic going on. The challenge for me, though, is how do you do all of this while maintaining the ability of good drama to reflect real life and complex characters, complex character development. I mean, there's a Hollywood dictum that says simple plots, complex characters, and then you can get away with anything. And I think that's a critique that can be brought to bear here. Simple characters here should not probably be given a simple treatment, even given your limitations. I mean, stock characters are important in a drama at times, one-dimensional characters, but your major characters cannot be, and you have to take great care as far as that goes. Whether you're talking about Pilate or Caiaphas, these are major characters. So why is he making these dramatic choices? Again, you don't have to have recourse to anti-Semitism, but there is insensitivity, I think, to ways that are probably unconscionable at this point in history. And that's too bad. It really is unfortunate in terms of people who want this film to be able to communicate to its audience. And another unfortunate thing about it is that these were easy fixes that could have been made. In conversations with screenwriter friends of mine, they said, just this line here would have worked to do that, to add this to this complexity. So that part is unfortunate because I think it would have been a better movie. Less controversy, less box office, but I think a better service to the story, and I think, and I care more about the story than box office, and I'm sure he does too, because this is meaningful, because this is so important to him. And also because I think this movie does have such strong, unique, distinctive qualities. It really could have been remembered for those, and really could have taken its place as one of the great treatments. Unfortunately, I think it's going to be remembered, at least for a while, as, or for its controversy.